Hi, my name's Selena, and today we are talking about the classics that I read in the month of May. So technically I only read 2 classic books this month, but one of those books had 12 short stories in it. The first classic that I completed was this collection of The Little Mermaid and Other Fairy Tales by Hans Christian Andersen. This is the Mina Lima Interactive Elements edition. This edition includes 12 stories, and each story kind of has different interactive elements that go with it, as well as very beautiful illustrations. And I loved reading this book. I read every single story in this book. I didn't plan on reading every single story. I was only going to read a few and maybe work through it slowly, but I just kind of flew through it. I was in such a fairy tale mood. I loved rereading these. I had read most of Andersen's stories in this collection before now. This collection was such a great experience to read. I think it is one of the best collections of Andersen's stories because it really shows you the highlights of his work. It shows you what is the popular stories in his work. It's kind of like a best of book of Andersen. The first time I read a lot of these stories, I read them out of this collection of The Little Mermaid and Other Fairy Tales, which is the Barnes & Noble edition, the new one. The Barnes & Noble collection definitely gives you more stories, but they are full of his less well-known stories, and I don't think that this collection gives you as good of a tidbit of Andersen's work. I would highly recommend this Mina Lima interactive edition over the Barnes & Noble edition. This is a better selection of Andersen's work overall than the Barnes & Noble edition, in my opinion. I gave this edition as a whole 5 stars because I love the art, I love the interactive elements, I love the stories they picked for this, and I loved most of the stories and gave most of them 4.5 or 5 stars. So I'm not going to go into all of the stories that I read. I did rate all of these stories on my Goodreads, and so you can go into Goodreads and if you type in The Little Mermaid, it should come up and you can see all of my star ratings for all the stories in this collection, but for this video, I'm only going to talk about my favorites. My favorite stories in this collection were The Little Mermaid, The Nightingale, The Princess and the Pea, Thumbelina, The Ugly Duckling, The Snow Queen, and The Steadfast Tin Soldier. The things I loved about these stories was partially nostalgia because I grew up with a lot of Andersen's stories, and partially I just love them for what they are. They have a lot more detail than the Brothers Grimm stories. Brothers Grimm stories tend to be quite short and funny and to the point, whereas Andersen really takes his time building an atmosphere, writing description, creating these stories from literally scratch. They're a lot more fleshed out than the Grimms, and I think part of that comes from the Grimms are writing down tales that they hear over the countryside of Germany, and so a lot of their stories are orally told tales. They have to be short and snappy. They don't spend too much time on description, whereas Andersen is writing these and making these tales up himself, and so they're his original works, and so he has the time to really flesh them out a lot more, and I really enjoyed that. I would also say that Andersen writes more emotional stories, and they're less darkly funny than the Grimm stories. I really enjoy both the Grimms and Andersen, but I do think they bring different things to the table, and I think they're both worth a read. I thoroughly enjoyed myself with this. Going through quickly the stories that I gave high ratings in this book, I'm not going to be giving any descriptions for these fairy tales because there's just not enough to say. They're too short for me to give proper descriptions, and you probably know a lot of these stories anyways. I loved The Little Mermaid. I gave it 5 stars. I thought it was so immersive and beautiful and kind of dark and haunting in a way, and just so beautiful, and I love that story. I highly recommend it. And then after that I move on to The Nightingale, which is again just so immersive and beautifully colored. The illustrations in this one take my breath away, and I remember them so vividly, and they just really stuck with me, and this story really stuck with me. The Princess and the Pea! Oh my goodness, this one was so short and so funny, and I have a lot of nostalgia associated with this one. I know this story very well. The voice of this story was very reminiscent of the Grimm's fairy tales, and so I would highly recommend this one if you are looking for more tales like the Grimm's to start with in Andersen. Thumbelina, I don't objectively love it as much as the other three that I just spoke about, but Thumbelina is very nostalgic for me. I have very vivid memories of reading Thumbelina out of an illustrated children's book with my grandmother as a child. I loved the story of Thumbelina. I loved the idea of tiny things. I loved to collect little tiny knickknacks as a kid, and so the idea of this tiny woman living in a flower just was so cool to me. The Ugly Duckling was honestly a surprise because I don't tend to like fairy tales or stories in general following animals talking to each other. I can sometimes do a story with an animal talking to a human. Occasionally, The Little Prince, one of my favorite books, has that sort of thing going on. But I don't tend to like stories that are just about animals, and The Ugly Duckling is that. It is about animals, but it deals with very human themes, and I thought it was like short enough and sweet enough and nostalgic enough for me to really enjoy it a lot more than I thought I was going to. The Snow Queen is by far the longest story of Andersen's in this collection. I don't know if it's his longest story he's ever written, but it's definitely one of his longest stories. It's a fairy tale in, I think, 7 parts, and you probably know this story because this is the story that Frozen was actually based off of, and I would recommend that you don't go in expecting too much to be similar to Frozen. The bones of Frozen are there, but that's about it. It's not really a strict interpretation of the Snow Queen. It's quite different, but it is fun to see where they took things for Frozen from this story. It's still a beautiful story, even if it's not exactly like the movie, and it also is pretty reminiscent of Narnia, I've heard people say, and after hearing people say that, I totally agree. I think this story is very influential, even if it's not one of his most well-remembered stories, compared to something like The Little Mermaid. And The Steadfast Tin Soldier was a surprise to me. I did not expect to love this story because I didn't know I knew it, but I started reading it and I was hit with this nostalgia, and I believe that this was one of the stories that I read with my grandmother as a kid because I knew the actions that was going to happen, I knew the beats of the plot, I knew this story. Something about it really clicked with me, and my memory just came back, and the nostalgia more than anything really gave this story a higher rating. It is a sadder story than some of the others that I've mentioned, but a good bit of these stories are tragedies, and Andersen likes to write tragic fairy tales. I think that's one of the reasons why I think he's so interesting, and his fairy tales are just really something different, and I think he's so talented. I love these stories. I highly recommend you read them. I love fairy tales. I love Andersen. There isn't much more to say. The next and last classic that I read this month was Mansfield Park by Jane Austen. I would have read more. I planned to read more, but Mansfield Park just took me a longer time than I thought it would. I had planned to read other classics this month, but I found that I wasn't in the mood for any of them and I couldn't really pick them up, and I didn't want to pick them up and not enjoy them, and so I just chose to follow my heart and go for a Jane Austen book, and I decided to, instead of rereading one of the books of hers that I had read, I wanted to pick one of the 2 books of hers that I had not read yet, and Mansfield Park was the one I went for first, mainly because I've heard people say it's not the best Jane Austen, and I didn't want that to be my last Jane Austen. I wanted to end on a high with her. But Mansfield Park is quite a long book compared to Jane Austen's other novels. It's more around the size of Emma, and it took me quite a bit. It's also a lot slower than Jane Austen's other novels. It's got drama, but a different type of drama than Jane Austen. Jane Austen loves to deal with like romance and social scandals, but Mansfield Park is honestly one of her most scandalous, I think. It's just written in a way where I think that it's probably just not as gripping as, let's say, the scandals in like Pride and Prejudice or something. Mansfield Park was not my favorite Jane Austen. I gave it 3.5 stars, but I still really liked it because a 3.5 stars on the Jane Austen scale is better than like most 3.5 stars out there, if not all of them. I still enjoyed this book. I really liked Fanny. I have heard mixed things about her, but I personally liked her. At first, I wasn't completely on board with her, and then as the book went on, I got more and more attached to her. I think one of the reasons people don't love Mansfield Park is because it does have a stricter focus on morals and moral characters almost. I think Jane Austen judges certain characters of hers very harshly in all of her books that I've read. But Mansfield Park, I would say, is the one where I felt like Jane Austen didn't just satirize terrible people, she created people who she's really working hard to make us dislike. And I would have preferred for her to let them be themselves and let the readers kind of just figure it out on their own a little bit. But I still really did enjoy the story despite that. I also think the pacing was drawn out and slow, as I said, but the ending hit really fast and ended really abruptly, especially in the romance department. Everything went down very abruptly, and it honestly, a lot of the concluding of this book happened off page in a way. I think that in her other books, we at least got to spend a little bit more time with the characters before the book concluded. We did not in this one. In the end, I agree with a lot of people about Mansfield Park. It's still a Jane Austen book, and so it's still miles ahead of most authors out there, if not every author out there, in my opinion. But it has a lot of Austen traits that are not as well executed as they are in other Austen novels. I think that it does some things right, and it does some things in ways that I would have liked to be done differently. That being said, I still love this book. I still love Jane Austen. I still think that she's brilliant, and you can definitely see her brilliance in this book as well as her others. It's just not my favorite personally, and it is a lot of people's favorite, so there are definitely people who disagree with me on this. Well, that went by fast. I only had 2 books to talk about, but I mean, hopefully next month I will be reading more classics. Until then, I'll see you next time. Bye.